Bali Principles of Climate Change. An international coalition of groups, collectively called the International Climate Justice Network, gathered in Johannesburg for the Earth Summit, has released in August 29, 2002, a set of principles aimed at putting a human face on climate change. The Bali Principles of Climate Justice redefine climate change from a human rights and environmental justice perspective. The principles were developed by the coalition, which includes CorpWatch, Third World Network, Oil Watch, the Indigenous Environmental Networks, among others, at the final preparatory negotiations for the Earth Summit in Bali in June 2002. Preamble. Whereas climate change is a scientific reality whose effects are already being felt around the world. Whereas, if consumption of fossil fuels, deforestation, and other ecological devastation continues at current rates, it is certain that climate change will result in increased temperatures, sea level rise, changes in agricultural patterns, increased frequency and magnitude of natural disasters such as floods, droughts, loss of biodiversity, intense storms, and epidemics. Whereas, deforestation contributes to climate change while having a negative impact on a broad array of local communities. Whereas, communities and the environment feel the impacts of the fossil fuel economy at every stage of its life cycle, from exploration to production to refining to redistribution to consumption to disposal of waste. Whereas climate change and its associated impacts are a global manifestation of this local chain of impacts. Whereas fossil fuel production and consumption helps drive corporate-led globalization. Whereas climate change is being caused primarily by industrialized nations and transnational corporations. Whereas the multilateral development banks, transnational corporations, and northern governments, particularly the United States, have compromised the democratic nature of the United Nations as it attempts to address the problem. Whereas the perpetration of climate change violates the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the United Nations Convention on Genocide. Whereas the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt by small island states, women, youth, coastal peoples, local communities, indigenous peoples, fisherfolk, poor people, and the elderly. Whereas local communities, affected people, and indigenous peoples have been kept out of the global processes to address climate change. Whereas market-based mechanisms and technological fixes currently being promoted by transnational corporations are false solutions and are exacerbating the problem. Whereas unsustainable production and consumption practices are at the root of this and other global environmental problems. Whereas this unsustainable consumption exists primarily in the North, but also among elites within the South. Whereas the impacts will be most devastating to the vast majority of the people in the South, as well as the South within the North. Whereas the impacts of climate change threaten food sovereignty and the security of livelihoods of natural resource-based local economies. Whereas the impacts of climate change threaten the health of communities around the world, especially those who are vulnerable and marginalized, in particular children and elderly people. Whereas combating climate change must entail profound shifts from unsustainable production, consumption, and lifestyles, with industrialized countries taking the lead.